Good morning. You know, it's been said often that the only sure thing in life is death and taxes. But I would like to say one other thing is sure, Jesus Christ. And one other thing is sure that you'll experience in this life is times of waiting. It's interesting in this Holy Week as we move toward Jesus' final hours and his arrest and his beating and his mockery of a trial and his condemnation and his scourging and his crucifixion and his death. And once his body is taken off the cross and he's laid in the tomb, in the 23rd chapter of Luke, it ends this way. It says, the women who had come with Jesus out of Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid, and then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. And on the Sabbath, they rested. They waited according to the commandments of God. It's interesting to me that when God first gives the commandments to Moses on the mount, right, and gives the commandments about how we are to be in relationship with God and with others, that in that fourth commandment, God says, remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. And so the women are doing just that. And when he gives this command clear back in Exodus, he already knows that this specific Sabbath day will come. That day immediately following the death of his son, immediately following the crucifixion of his son, and all the strong emotions that must have been happening for the disciples and the followers, the confusion and the chaos, the bewilderment and the disappointment and the discouragement and the anger at the injustice and just the sorrow and grief. The weight of that day was coming. And in his command to rest, he knew that this was one of those moments where resting in the Lord was so needful and necessary. I know we live in a day and age where it seems like anytime when we feel those strong kinds of emotions, anger, disappointment, sorrow, discouragement, we tend to just busy ourselves. We want to numb that feeling. We don't want to rest in that feeling at all. We want to be distracted. I mean, think of the waiting rooms you've sat in over the years of your life. The waiting rooms in hospitals and doctors' offices that are filled with coffee machines and magazines and television screens, and there's no waiting happening there. They should be called distraction rooms. And yet God sees and knows what is most needful at our times of discouragement and disappointment, and those times that will inevitably come where we have to wait in the midst of unknown futures. This was one of those moments, the women, the followers of Jesus, waiting. And rather than get busy and discouraged, and rather than forego observing the commands of God, they simply follow his instruction and they rested on the Sabbath. Now, that word rest is interesting. That word rest means to cease, to cease from any work, to stay quiet, to not labor. It was a rest for the body. It was a rest for the mind and the spirit. It could be done in fellowship with other family members and other friends and things gathered. They would eat a meal that had been prepared the night before, and they would simply enjoy one another's company. No, not many words needed to be spoken in those moments, but just being present with others was a way to refresh the soul, and especially being present with others who remind us of God's presence with us. And what more could these disciples and followers have needed at this moment in time when their friend Jesus had just suffered so much? Pushing off the temptation to be distracted, they simply rested with one another and in the Lord. Now, they thought they were resting and waiting on that Sabbath day, and that after the Sabbath was over, they were going to go and prepare Jesus' body. Little did they know that the waiting and resting in the Lord was preparing them for an incredibly unimaginable surprise when they would go to the tomb and discover the body was no longer there, that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead. But we can't overlook that time of rest, that time of needful just being in the presence of God and being in the company of others who can sit with us in the midst of those strong emotional times, those times of struggle and tribulation, and know that we're not alone in those things. That they're not things that we need to solve or fix or quickly move out of, but that we can rest with the Lord in the midst of the mess. Because that's who God is, a God who comes to us in the midst of the mess. And as we rest in him and as we get to know God, that's the rest of that verse in Psalm 46:10. Cease striving and know that I am God. The word know there means to recognize, to acknowledge, to become keenly aware of God in the midst of the waiting, in the midst of the situation. So I pray this week, as you will inevitably have times of waiting, whether it's in line at the grocery store or at the traffic light or in a doctor's office, or as you're waiting for a phone call or an email, that you allow that to be a time where you can be aware, you can know who God is, that you won't be tempted to you'll kind of resist the temptation to turn on the noise and be distracted, but you'll simply just take a big breath and say, God, where are you in the midst of this time of waiting? Where are you in this moment as I wait for the next thing? And don't be surprised that God may surprise you with things that you never could imagine possible. And so, fellow believers, brothers and sisters, and anyone else who's listening to this, I pray this Holy Week would be a time of holy waiting, holy expectations, and that as we remember what Jesus did for us, so that we could know him, so that we could spend eternity with the Father, that we know that eternity begins now, that we can now know who God is, even in the midst of the mess. Holy waiting this week. I love you all very much. See you soon.